Stray, if nothing else, is a strong argument that you can come up with a decently compelling concept for a game by picking two random works of art, a theme, and wrapping the whole thing in tape. Homeward Bound meets Blade Runner, but instead of being an Animals with Voices movie or a deep meditation on the nature of it not being quite as good as you remember, it's about letting a cat fight cops. It's also a particularly strange game to look at critically. If you try to separate it into any specific genre, it doesn't really succeed at any of them. The platforming is mediocre, the puzzles are overly simple, and the exploration is hampered by an intrusive but at times annoyingly necessary UI. The good news for the funny little cat game, though, is that most modern studies agree that genre is a spectrum, so failing in these binary angles doesn't make it a bad game. The bad news is that this is a review, not a sales pitch, so I'm gonna have to try and figure out how to make talking about the most average game mechanics on Earth interesting, and historically, my strategy of doing that with sci-fi games made by a four-letter word and a number from one of the World War II countries has a tendency to be a cause for international incident. The worst news is that Surfshark is no longer interested in pursuing advertisements on my channel at this time for some reason. So the unrelated news is that I'd like to introduce all of you to Maria, the unofficial new mascot for Bluetooth-enabled personal massager brand and sponsor of this video, Lovin's. Lovin's produces extremely high-quality app-enhanced products that I may or may not be using the actual names of right this second because I'm not confident we're past the 1 minute mark and YouTube's weird about that shit. Anyways, Lovin's pocket pussies, butt plugs, and vibrators are not only made from high-quality, safe materials, they're also Bluetooth-enabled and offer a wide variety of additional features through the remote app. For starters, if you're in a long-distance relationship, you can give control of your vibrator to your partner, and if they have a compatible toy of their own, you can even sync them together, and I think I have to stop there no matter how many minutes into the video I am. There's also weirder features, like the ability to sync the vibration motors to music, and I know I've gotten a lot of you into Kiltro, so why not let me get Kiltro into you? It doesn't end there either. In addition to officially supporting multiple alternate video games, if you know how to use GitHub, you can even get it to sync to supposedly normal games like Final Fantasy XIV, and if you play that and know how to use GitHub, let's be honest, you need one. So, if you've ever wanted to be blasted in more than just chat for fucking up the raid mechanics, use the referral link on screen and at the top of the description. It'll take you to the landing page for one with innovative new fingering technology, but the sale itself is site-wide. If you're wondering, I've been trying for a few hours and there's no way to ethically transition from that back to talking about the funny cat game, so I'm just going to request that you keep in mind I got that sponsorship well after writing this thesis. Let's start with something extremely simple, because the majority of this script is me trying to justify it's just cat vibes as an analytical conclusion, and the biggest thing standing in the way of those is the fucking HUD. This is gonna sound weird for a game with such pointedly simple mechanics as automatically jump to platform and meow, but playing with the HUD enabled, honest to God, feels like cheating. Like I said, the jumping isn't precision, it's automated. Think Freeform Uncharted, except when it's regulation Kenny G Uncharted. That leaves figuring out which platforms to use while traversing an area as the sole bit of gameplay to engage with during the platform sections. Which is fine in and of itself. A cat isn't generally gonna struggle to be a horrible goblin freak on the dystopian city streets, but the game goes on to mark every single platform you can reach with a little white circle, and when the execution of the platforming is a non-factor, I'm not sure completely removing the requirement to think is a great design decision. What's weird is that the cat's body language already tells you when you can jump on a platform, looking directly at any acceptable platform that you pointed at, so it's not like consideration for communicating the information otherwise wasn't taken. You could probably make the argument that the white circles are a good thing since they allow the platforming to be satisfying via fluidity rather than complexity or problem solving, which is fair enough, but if I'm role-playing Paradise Lost, I want to at least earn my fucking stripes. That's only one part of it though. The real reason I wanted to bring up the HUD is the way it hampers the possible excitement and intrigue that could come from exploring the game's different areas. To sum it up as simply as possible, if every single thing of note in the environment is marked by the HUD, you're discouraging me from looking closely at anything else. The reasons for this are pretty self-explanatory, so do us both a favor and don't think too hard about my feeling compelled to explain them anyways and what that means about this cute little dynamic we've got going on. If everything necessary to advancing the game is explicitly marked by a white circle that I'm just meant to walk up to and press interact on, the game is not giving me any reason to engage with the rest of the environment. I don't think it's overreaching to say that's a bit of a problem when exploration is some of the only gameplay you've got to begin with and environment design outranks it on selling points, especially considering how good, if a bit derivative, the latter can be at times. That's not entirely fair, actually. The gameplay bit, not the derivative bit. It's less that Stray is lacking in gameplay, it's more that all the different breeds of gameplay are kept separate and are not equally or adequately explored. An element of puzzle solving is introduced, and at least partially in a way that really jives with the whole concept of you're a fucking cat quite well. Pawing things off ledges and rolling barrels around is a great start, but it never really grows beyond that, and not devising a physics puzzle in which I can bodily fling a feline when all the animations are essentially canned already is making the manifesto. Instead, the puzzle design tends to come down to rolling a barrel somewhere so you can reach a higher spot, occasional one-dimensional object knocking, luring stuff onto pressure pads, and scavenger hunts. The only exceptions that immediately come to mind are a few moments that recontextualize mechanics that initially seem to just be there so you could act like a cat, and a bit that might be a Metal Gear reference, but I can't say for sure since I've only played the good one. On the subject of incredible violence, this is the first game I've played in a while that's had not only one, but a fair few of those semi-scripted rum from some bullshit sequences that were all the rage before lonely white dudes in their mid-20s were allowed on YouTube to finally invent game design. To the Funny Cat Game's credit, it does a better job at making the danger feel real in these sequences than most by letting the things whose names I'm not going to Google be a bigger threat than most hazards you typically find in this trope's heyday. At times it came down to actually having to pay attention and react to avoid getting swarmed and learning that you're far more disturbed by watching a cat get bloodlessly covered in orange bugs than the evisceration of silly spaceman via stretchy skeleton and subsequently assuming there's nothing to dissect there. Out of all the gameplay styles, I'd say this is surprisingly the one with the most bones to stand on. It's easily the one that the game develops the most over the course of its runtime, and outside of the broad concept of exploring, it's the only one with a few interesting points of overlap with the others. I mean, yeah, the platforming and puzzles are technically integrated, but only by nature of the fact that you are a cat and therefore either catatonic or jumping on shit you shouldn't be. That'll make its way into the puzzles when there's an area of freight elevator of mechanical wiggle room to begin with. Which is fine, by the way. Not every game needs to nor should be ultra kill, and as an aside, if you hate the hard damage whiplash nerf, that was my fault, and I'm not sorry. Back to the point though. I find it interesting that despite Stray otherwise pretty universally paring down every other type of gameplay it dabbles in into their most basic forms, it takes something so basic and borderline non-interactive and expands on it to the point where it's genuinely fun. It's made me think about potential game design problem solving I probably never would have otherwise. There's a point earlier on where one of the run from some bullshit sequences takes place in an enclosed arena within a time limit rather than as a means of getting from A to B. It was fun, actually kind of intense, and became thought-provoking in a later area where the game once again utilizes arenas after giving you a GAT. It's probably the most revealing part of the whole experience in terms of gameplay, because after giving you the gun, the game immediately kicks it into the fucking river because someone realized what a fucking terrible idea it was. Still though, it acts as a combination of the two styles since the triple quotes combat hinges around micromanaging your gun's battery while running around trying to avoid getting slopped on. Hell, since none of the enemies communicate with each other, you could even say it's integrated into the stealth, optionally turning those segments into a version of the cinematic running with slightly more player agency. Though I will admit, I didn't find that out until I watched a speedrun of the game, and that brings me back to my thesis. This game succeeds entirely off the back of how much work and effort was put into the cat part of cat game, as evidenced by the fact that seeing a cat move with that much purpose was viscerally fucked up. I did not like it. I'm not sure how the fuck a nap skip is achieved, but I know succeeding at it is a moral failure. And that pretty much wraps it up for gameplay, a segment where people who haven't played the game may think I'm really skipping over the surface, and people who have are asking, why the fuck are you talking about the gameplay for so long? Fact of the matter is, nobody is buying this game for its gameplay, and the only reason I spent even that much time talking about it is because I've got a mental tapeworm and can't just say, the gameplay is serviceable and does what it needs to. The gameplay is a vehicle for being a cat, not the other way around, and that is the clear and obvious central pillar of the game itself. It's weird, if you asked me what was better, the gameplay or the story, I would tell you the story in a heartbeat, but it's also so much worse at supporting that pillar. I'm not going to give a play-by-play of the story itself as, despite being better than the gameplay, it's really thoroughly not very interesting to break down on a plot level. What you need to know for the purposes of the rest of this video is humanity is dead, cat in hole, hole is robots. Also, the robots have formed a strict caste society, which you must ascend and liberate by combining your efforts with a myriad of companions. And shout out to my boy Momo, I don't give a fuck if he couldn't pass the Bechdel test, he was a real one. In all seriousness, I don't have any issues with the story of Stray itself. It's a pretty boilerplate post-human society sci-fi plot with some decent enough theming, and it tugs on my weird, specific robots feeling fear and making sacrifices always makes my heart come strings well enough for me to enjoy it. The things I most want to talk about are, and because it's fucking me, let's all say it together now, the themes and the way the story itself is told. I'll start with the latter, since that can be summed up pretty quickly. Stray's story could have, and if you're correct, should have been told with zero dialogue whatsoever. As is, the story of Stray is primarily told via characters speaking directly to the cat in chat bubbles in one-sided conversations, requesting that he do something or explaining something that's going on. It's also built out a bit more on a character and theming level by finding and unlocking memories for B12, your flying robot companion, but I didn't find all of those, so I just looked them up on YouTube. Fuck you. While I appreciate the acknowledgement that cats instinctively fully understand English and are just like that anyways, telling the story this traditionally creates a lesser version of the issue I had with the speedrun. A cat moving around and doing things with a clear and present sense of purpose is weird. It just doesn't jive with the rest of the vibes. Obviously, a lot of things in this game would need to be changed to accomplish this, like allowing B12 to talk to the characters in the incomprehensible beeps and boops and having him fly around to direct the cat with his movements like an owner would, only to be met with the cat's cold, blank stare, wholly unconcerned with the impending scramble for control of the mother serpent, which the player could replicate quite well by simply choosing to ignore the objectives for now to further explore the environment. The whole story could even still exist in the same form it does now. You wouldn't have to get rid of any of the speech bubbles to achieve this because the developers gave the companions their entire own language and alphabet, which may have even added to the story by making it a communal effort to translate and put the details of the plot together. I doubt it would even take that long to have decent community resources for it, as the language seems to use Bionicle rules and not be a full, real language constructed whole cloth by someone who really wants to get something out of that minor and ancient Italian. But if it is, why? By doing this, you keep the core story and themes, but unlike the version we got, it would have an additional sense of wonder, because it would feel more authentically like a random actual cat surrounded by robots by sheer happenstance is the piece that winds up setting them free. There are people so dedicated to the goal of opening the city, of getting out, despite others treating it like a delusional pipe dream, and given that a decent amount of theming is about life, death, and rebirth, I think it would be interesting for the goal to be accomplished due to a wrinkle that they actually, truly had no proper control over. In fairness, this game was made by a pretty small team, and it being that complex might not have been on the cards, but in fairness, most of the dialogue is bad and I don't want to read it. I understand that not everyone may agree with that opinion, which is perfectly fine. I'm a memory leak with legs, pretty equally used to being a visionary and an idiot. Speaking of that, let's get on to my favorite part of the video, where I get to be pretentious and annoying about potential themes and readings of the text, and since I didn't give you a recap, you're at my fucking mercy with this one. The core theme I got out of Stray was an exploration on what the concept of life really means. Like, what it means to be alive, not some generic what is the meaning of life shit. A big part of that exploration is centered around death, which is probably obvious, what with it being set in the aftermath of the extinction of our own species and all. I've recently remembered that you're usually not supposed to spoil major plot points in reviews, so I won't say who all dies over the course of the story, but I will say that when it's done in ways that firmly establish their existences as legitimate. Death cannot exist without life, so in order for these things to die, their life was valid. They were real. And with death, there comes rebirth. Life is cyclical, and I think a major point that Stray is putting forward is that the death of Homo sapiens is not the death of humanity itself. The companions are humanity now. The game makes references to how their behaviors mimic that of humans about 1 billion times, and if that wasn't enough signposting, B12 himself acts as a bridge between them and humanity, being the resurrected, digitized consciousness of a long-dead human scientist and also your only means of communication. In more ways than one, B12 represents a translation of what humanity is, a passing of the torch, the surprisingly graceful, peaceful end to the era of man. We are goofy, clumsy bags of blood, and given the opportunity, we will automate humanity, and it will be better than us, and it will be the death of us, and it won't be evil for it. It will be humanity. Being human is a trait ascribed on the individual level. It isn't as simple as ticking a few boxes. There is something intangible about it that doesn't require a bunch of banana DNA. One of the most consistent motifs across the entire game is characters mentioning that the plants in the underground are real plants that were produced with the capability to grow without sunlight, a requirement for life in all plants as we understand them now. But they are always called that. They're plants. The stake-raising threat in the final segment isn't death, it's a reversion of the companion's humanity. To erase that intangible, undefinable element, to use the game's own metaphor, hair is not a necessary ingredient for a successful barbershop. Fuck you. Stray is a lot like Elden Ring, not because it shares genre tags with The Surge, but because they both demonstrate in different ways that it's stupid to look at good game design as some kind of piss measuring contest. There aren't actually rules, and often the most important thing to emphasize in development is completely intangible. If Stray was a more compelling platformer, or a stronger puzzle game, or had more fluid traversal, it wouldn't remain a game where you experience the rehabilitation of the desolate remains of a post-human society whilst cat. This desire to delineate things with complete and total accuracy is also an issue with genre. It's what leads to a bunch of Zerks meeting up in Berlin to gaslamp me into thinking the term roguelite exists. And I'm sorry, but no matter how much I like On-Site, I'm not backing team nerds in Germany get in a room and separate things into arbitrary groups. Stray is good because it was developed under a different lens than most games. It was developed under the lens of, we gotta nail the cat vibes. And it's clear they did, because if you ask me what genre it is, I'm gonna tell you orange, fuckhead. I'm trans, by the way.
My life's a lot like that. Hot straps and cigarettes. If these clothes go blunt and cracked, when I'm lame and limp in past, eyes wide with cataracts, while I'm one can still you know.